Hi folks, it's just me again, Walter Shepard. This particular little rambling, meandering is to encourage a lot of you to read the Old Testament, read the whole Bible. It's great to have our favorite books, and it's great to have our favorite verses, but as you know, we are commanded to be as much like Jesus as possible. And if we're going to be like Jesus, then we should know the very Bible that he knew. And his Bible is our Old Testament. So, read your Old Testament, because there's a lot more to it than you realize. The book of Proverbs, it's a great book for social interaction. It gives you all these great instructions and all these great lessons and all these great examples of how to deal with people in the real world. Not just your family and not just your friends, but people out there in the business world, people out there in society in general. The book of Proverbs is good for that. So a lot of great life lessons there and a lot of great examples of how we should be when it comes to other people. And the book of Psalms too. That's a great book if you want to understand God interacting with people, how he feels about all people in general, his servants, as well as his chosen, as well as the Gentiles, as well as the nations of the world. It's all there. Ecclesiastes is another great book. It was written in Solomon's latter years when he was getting a little depressed because of his wasted life. He may have been one of the richest men around, and one of the smartest men around, but he did a lot of things he wasn't supposed to do, and because of that, towards the end of his life, he got a little depressed. But he still wrote a great book when it comes to Ecclesiastes. There's a lot of great life lessons in there. What else is there? The Song of Psalms, or the Song of Songs. It's a good book of poetry, but personally, I have a hard time getting through it. Through some of the poetry itself, but I've still read it. And what other ones? The book of the prophets, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and then all the minor prophets that follow that, all the way up to Malachi, which is the last book in the Old Testament. And they are great books in terms of when God shows the supernatural and the hypernatural things that happen in the lives of his servants and in the lives of individuals. And there's also a lot of great adventure stories too, when you come down to the earlier books. The Torah, the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, as well as the book of Judges and the book of Kings. There's a lot of great adventure stories from there too. And there's a lot of great examples of God interacting, again, in a super and a hypernatural way with people in general, with humans. And that's what I'm going to go through now. I'm going to go through a lot of the verses, and there's quite a few of them, quite a few of them, so I'm going to go through as quickly as possible. But some of the my favorite verses that I've come across, let's see. One of them is in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 1 to 7, and I'll just summarize it. As one of them, there was somebody cutting down trees. As one of them were cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. "O Lord," he cried out, "it was borrowed." The man of God asked, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, Elisha took a stick and threw it there and made the iron float. And again, that speaks of a number of different ways that God could have done that. I talked with one pastor, and he said, "Oh, there was just an angel there that lifted up the axe head," and that could be too. But personally, I believe God interacted with the quantum nature of metal, and he changed the quantum nature of metal to be that similar of wood, so that it was still steel, but it had the buoyancy property of wood. Or it could be some other way. God could have spoken to the metal itself in the axe head and caused it to float. He could cause it to defy gravity. He could have caused iron to defy gravity. Again, We have no idea exactly how it happened, but we will when we get to heaven. God will explain that to us. But somehow God made iron float like wood. And there's another one in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 to 6. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. You will drink from the brook, and I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. So he did what the Lord had told him. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So that's the Lord again speaking to his creation, speaking to the ravens themselves, and getting them to help feed one of his prophets. Let's see, there's another one, 2 Kings 18, verses 38 and 39. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" And we all heard that story about Elijah challenging the false prophets or the prophets of other gods, and God showing Himself being able to do something that the other gods could not do. Let's see, there's another one. 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 41 to 46. So Elijah said, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, and a heavy rain came up, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and, tucking in his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. So there's another example of a hypernatural event in which the Lord affects the physical nature of the human being, allowing him to run a great distance faster than horses. And I think I measured that out one time. I think that's about 300 miles he ran, if not longer. But again, I found these notes. I made these notes back in the 90s when all these visions were coming to me and I was studying the Bible. So, I'm kind of 20 years out of memory with a lot of the details, which is why I write them down, so I won't have to remember them. Elijah. Okay, and here's another one in 2 Kings, chapter 2, verses 8 and 14, because it happened twice. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. So that was Elijah and Elisha. They were crossing the river Jordan, and that was another example of the Lord taking control of the water, taking command of the quantum nature of nature, basically, and he just caused the water to stop, to create a path along the river Jordan, just like he did on a larger scale when Moses took the children out of Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea. So Elijah did that on a smaller level. I've seen the River Jordan. I was lucky enough in the 90s to go on a working vacation with the church that I was going to, West Calgary Full Gospel Church. I was the videographer there. And if you go back into the uploads, way back into the early ones, 3-4 years ago, you'll see some of the videos that I did. We did one by the East Gate, one in the one in Armageddon, or the Valley of Armageddon, and a whole bunch of others. But anyway, I got to see the River Jordan, which was the original point that I was making. And it's not a huge river. It's just like any other sort of river or stream or whatever. If it wasn't so fast flowing, we could have gone down inside and just waded into it. Waded into Jordan, the River Jordan. Let's see another one. These last two that I'm going to read, and I've got a whole bunch more that I made notes on, as you can see down there at the bottom. I will just give a brief sort of summary on those ones. But the last two that I want to read, it comes from Job chapter 40, and that it speaks of dinosaurs. It doesn't say which dinosaur in particular, but I would imagine because of the size that we know them, when he talks about the behemoth, they're talking about all dinosaurs in general, or dinosaurs in general. Anyway, to summarize, it says, "Look at the behemoth, which feeds on ox like a straw. His tail sways like a cedar, and cedars in the Middle East are huge. He ranks first among the works of God, and we know the dinosaurs are some of the first creatures that God made. Can anyone capture him by the eyes, or trap him and pierce his nose? See, dinosaurs were that huge, and I believe in the time of Job, they were still walking around. And personally, I believe dinosaurs were still walking around even in the days of knights. I believe those tales that you hear of knights going out and slaughtering dragons, I believe the dragons that they were slaughtering were actually the last of the dinosaurs. And to take it one step further, one of the early dinosaurs, I believe, was snake-like, and it had legs. It had 4 legs or more legs, but it was actually snake, like those, like the Chinese dragons that you see. They're just great big long snake-like creatures. I believe that it was one of those creatures that Satan had convinced and Satan had possessed to speak to Adam and Eve in the garden. Because remember, after God set the curse on Adam and Eve, and the curse that he gave to the serpent was, from that point on, you will crawl on your belly. So I believe at some point a snake-like creature had legs, and that was the type of servant that helped Adam and Eve fall. And because of that, God took away the legs, and we now end up with snakes that have no legs that crawl on their belly. And lastly, for this particular section, it also comes from Job, and Job is talking about the Leviathan, which is a creature that lives in the oceans. Can you pull in the Leviathan with a fishhook? Any hope of subduing him is false. The mere sight of him is overpowering. Firebrands stream from his mouth. Iron he treats like straw. Nothing on earth is his equal. And it goes on to say that the Leviathan is one of the greatest creatures that God has created, and God is very proud of the Leviathan because of his survival techniques and the size of him. And personally, I believe that this so-called Loch Ness Monster and all these other hidden monsters and all these other bodies of water all over the world, I believe that is the Leviathan, that he's smart enough to stay out of sight of man, and he doesn't have to live in any one particular body of water. I believe there are still a lot of underwater cisterns and underwater tunnels that connect freshwater lakes to even salt water, to even the ocean. And I believe the Leviathan, or a number of Leviathans, families of Leviathans, are swimming all around the place. They still exist. They cannot be destroyed, and God will keep them as his, basically, souvenir of one of his greatest creations. So that whenever somebody sees a Loch Ness Monster, they're actually seeing the Leviathan. God has allowed us to get little glimpses of him, but nothing in any full detail, and we will never see anything in full detail until the millennium, when they come back and we can see them exactly what they are, and God will let us know exactly what they are when we get to heaven. So we'll see what about the Leviathan and the Behemoth. Anyway, that's for that. I've got a whole bunch more to go through, and I will just go through them quickly. And again, this is just to entice and to encourage you to read the Old Testament, because the Old Testament has a lot of supernatural acts of God, some miraculous acts of God, and some hypernatural events that human beings are involved with. Okay, we start off in Joshua 3:12-17, where once again God piles up the water in a heap. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Hopefully you will go into it and search the whole story for yourself. Joshua 10, verses 12-14. The sun stands still for an entire day. And God balances that out later on. But again, I'm only going to give you the verse. I'm just kind of teasing you, trying to get you encouraged to go search out these stories for yourself. Judges 6:36-40. And that's the story of the fleece. Someone asked one of the prophets to prove or to I guess you could say, to prove the power of God in a particular choice. And so they sent out a fleece of wool and they put it in the middle of the floor, and they asked God, okay, I will believe that you're there, and I'm just paraphrasing. I will believe that you're there if in the morning there's dew on the ground all around the fleece, but there's no dew on the fleece itself. So the next morning that happened. There was dew all around the ground, but there was no dew on the fleece itself. And so the next night the guy said, okay, let me just make sure that that you are there, God. So let's reverse that. Let there be no dew on the ground, but just dew on the fleece. And of course, God proved himself. Okay, and then from there, Judges 6:19 to 21. There was a meal prepared, a sacrifice meal prepared, and an angel told the servant of the Lord to put the meal on a rock. And the angel touched the meal with the staff, and fire came up from the rock, and it consumed the meal, it consumed the sacrifice. 1 Samuel 5, verses 6 to 12. Tumors came on a bunch of people because they moved the Ark of the Covenant, and they knew they weren't supposed to. 2 Samuel 5, verses 23 to 25. There was this freaked out the enemies when they heard the sound of marching, the sound of armies marching in the treetops, even though there's no armies around. Somehow God made the sounds of the angel armies appear just in the treetops. Or maybe they were there, but they just couldn't see them. Anyway, it was the sound of the marching armies. Then we go to 1 Kings 17, verses 14 to 16. A jar of flour and a jug of oil were not used up for quite some time. It could have been a number of weeks, it could have been time, or it could have been a number of months. But Elijah was with this widow, and that was all that they had to survive. That's all they had to live in during this time of drought. But God made the flour. He just made it unending for that for the time that they needed it. 1 Kings 17 to 23. Elijah and God, they bring a little boy back to life. So it's one of the first recorded incidences of a resurrection. 1 King 19, 11 to 14. Elijah wants to talk with God, and Elijah wants to meet with God. And so there was a great big windstorm, and it smashed a bunch of rocks and fell down some mountains. Then there was an earthquake, and then there was a great fire. But God wasn't in any of those things. He was there in a whisper. And you have to read that for yourself. It's actually a pretty neat story. Let's see. 2 Kings chapter 1, verses 3 to 16. Where fire consumes a bunch of soldiers, 50 of them in general, and it does that twice. Fire comes down from the sky, and it consumes two groups of 50 men and their captains. And then 2 Kings chapter 2, that is the story of Elijah being raptured, or Elijah going up to heaven in a chariot of fire. And again, I use the word rapture because Elijah didn't die. His physical body, it got onto the chariot and it went up. So he was regenerated, I'm sure, at some point, either when he stepped on the chariot or as he entered into heaven. But Elijah did not see death, and that's the same with Enoch. He was one of the first men, again, taken up to heaven in a human body. Again, one of the first events of people being raptured. And there's also, that could have also happened with Moses too, because they couldn't find the body of Moses. Some say, like myself, that he was raptured. That's why they couldn't find his body. But some say it was hidden by the archangel Michael, because that was why Michael and Lucifer had a fight over the body of Moses. Anyhow, let's get on from there. Let's see. And then after Elijah goes up, the office of the prophet is given to Elisha. And in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 19 to 24, Elisha heals some poisoned water by throwing in some salt. And again, you'll have to read that story. 2 Kings chapter 3, verses 14 to 20. A valley fills with pools of water. And again, read the story. Again, these are just little hints, little enticements, little teasers, so that hopefully you can go to the main stories. 2 Kings, chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. A small jar of oil fills up many, many, many jars. Again, God's miraculous recreation or recreating or somehow making a continual flow of something, like he did with the feeding of the 5,000, the fish and the loaves. Speaking of which, that also comes up a little bit later on in the Old Testament too. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 to 44, in which another boy is brought back to life, where bad stew, somebody cooks some bad stew with some weeds, and Elisha makes it good by saying something and throwing in some flour. And then, like I said before, then there's the feeding of 100 with only 20 loaves of barley bread. And there was still some left over. Then we go to 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 6 to 14. There's an incident where Elisha cures leprosy with some people by making them do some stuff that seemed kind of repetitious, but again, read the story. It's a good story. 2 Kings, same chapter, chapter 5, verses 26 to 27. There was a greedy person there who did something they shouldn't have done, and so that person got leprosy on them instead. Okay, then we go to 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 to 20. When the angel armies appear, and there's chariots of fires and horses and angels, and it freaks out the opposing army. And then later on in the same story, a particular army is stricken with blindness, so that the Israelites could win the day or help the land. 2 Kings chapter 7, verses 5 to 7. Again, the sound of angel armies scare away the enemy. 2 Kings chapter 13, 21. Elisha's dead body, because at this point, sometime between chapter 7, or between, chapter 7 and chapter 13, Elijah passes away. He dies. And his bones are put in a cave, or his body is put in a cave, and I guess sometime later, however long later, it decays. And some guys have a particular body that they want to get rid of or they want to hide from somebody else. So they throw it in the cave, and the dead body, it touches Elisha's bones. And then that person comes back to life just by touching the bones of a prophet. That's how powerful Elisha was at the end of his ministry. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 3 to 5. There is a particular king for a particular reason who is afflicted with leprosy. Just like that. 2 Kings, oh boy. Okay, I'm going to assume it's chapter 17. I didn't put the little colon or the little dash there. So I'm going to assume it's, I can cross-reference it here. Yes, sorry. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 25. Where the Lord sends some lions to remove a bunch of people from the land. Again, he's talking to the animals, and the animals do his bidding. And there's so many other stories of that too in the Old Testament. Again, I encourage you to read the whole thing, because you'll see God working in the lives of men over and over and over again. It's just simply amazing. And let's see, the 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 6, 7, 32 to 37. And that is a particular story of where the angel of death comes and he strikes down 185,000 people, part of the enemy's army. And lastly, 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 1 to 11. And there was a particular person, I think it was Hezekiah, but I'm not sure again. I just made little notes, and again, I found these things way back in the 90s. But anyway, the whole point is the balance. So in 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 1 to 11, that's when the sun moves backwards. The shadow goes back down the steps instead of, as it usually does, going up the steps during the day. So the Lord recalibrated the orbit of the Earth, or the rotation of the Earth, by having the sun go back to rebalance it from when it stood still earlier. It stood still for, I think, a day and a half, something like that. And so having the sun stand still, the orbits and everything caught back up to each other. So again, those are just some examples of how creative God is, and how malleable the nature of this planet is, the nature of the universe. God has control over gravity. He has control over the rotation of the planet, or over the orbits of the planet. He has control over the quantum nature of matter. He can change the matter. He can talk to animals. He can strict people with any kind of disease. Again, it's all up to him. And again, it comes down to whether or not you're on his side, in which case you will get favored like a prophet, or if you choose to be his enemy, in which case you can be stricken down because of the fact that you are trying to oppose him. And again, those are just a lot of the, or some of the examples of how powerful God is. And again, there's a whole lot more. If you read the book of the prophets, especially Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, you can read a lot more about God. And there's even I forget which one wrote about it, but there's a description of being in heaven itself, and seeing Jesus on the throne with the rainbows and all, and everything that is described in the book of Revelation is redescribed in the book of the prophets too. But I will let you find that out for yourself, because that's the whole point of this video, is to encourage you to read the Old Testament. Personally, myself, I'm working on the 4th time reading it, and admittedly there is, I think, the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers I kind of skim over because it's not really relevant to our Christian walk. That has to do with the time that's coming, with God's chosen, with the Israelites, with the Jewish people. So that book is more relevant to them than it is to us. As is let's see, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, blah, blah, blah. And there's another one that talks about family lines and family histories. Again, not so relevant to us. So something like that, I will speed read. But when it comes to the other books, yes, I will read carefully, one word at a time, one verse at a time, one chapter at a time, one book at a time, because it is that interesting. I think since I became a believer in the 80s, I've read, like I said, I'm on my 4th reading of the whole Bible. And the book of Psalms, I've read scores of times. So and a score is 20. So I've read it like 20, 40, 60 times. The book of Proverbs I've read hundreds of times. And the New Testament itself I've read dozens of times, maybe 24 times, the whole thing. So and I believe that is why the Lord has shown me everything that he has shown me. Because, as it says in his book, where is that thing? Okay, I will get on with this. And it says right here, call to me and I will answer you. I will tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know. So if there's stuff that you want to know, like sort of hidden stuff or things like that, then just talk to the Lord, ask him. Because it also says in Isaiah, that last verse was from Jeremiah 33:3, and this one is from Isaiah 48:6-11. From now on I will tell you of new things, of hidden things unknown to you. They are created now and not long ago. You have not heard of them before today. And again, it just goes on and on. There's so many more verses like that talk about if you're with God, He will give you special blessings. If you search out His Word, He will give you special blessings. If you're in a strong relationship with Him, if you're praying with Him, praying to Him all the time, and being friends with Him, again, being as much like Jesus as possible is another way to get a special blessing from God. And being as much like Jesus as possible is reading the Old Testament. That's His Bible. That's part of our Bible too. So Anyway, that's that. I hope I've encouraged you to strengthen up your relationship with the Lord, not only with Jesus, not only with the Holy Spirit, but God Himself too, our Heavenly Father. Because there's those times He can be your dad, He can be your Abba Father, He can be your pop, He can be your old man, and you can just talk to Him on a personal level. You can even have a good laugh with Him. But get to know Him more through the Old Testament. Okay, so that's it. Be a blessing wherever you are in internet land and YouTube world. We'll see you in Jesus' kingdom somewhere over there, or maybe somewhere up in the air. Take care, stay in prayer, and remember, Jesus rules.